It's February 2024 and time for another episode of Diabetes Care on Air, a fun way to bring the research in diabetes care to life. My name is Mike Rickles from the University of Pennsylvania.
And I'm Alice Chang from the University of Toronto, and we are your co-hosts for this podcast series.
As per our usual, Alice and I will be interviewing authors of feature articles as selected by the editors of Diabetes Care, followed by our rapid exchange segment, where we will give brief summaries of articles we found of particular interest.
I want to remind our listeners about an important time-limited opportunity to get 25% off the membership price for your first year if you join the American Diabetes Association as a new professional member. Just use the code NEW24 or NEW24 during checkout to get the 25% off your first year's membership. Mike, can you share a bit about what professional membership can offer?
Sure, Alice. There are discounts on conferences, subscription to Diabetes Care, or another ADA journal of your choice, a copy of the Standards of Care in Diabetes, and continuing education opportunities, including webinars. Most importantly, access to an international community of professionals who share your passion and dedication to fight to end diabetes.
So if you've been considering joining the ADA, now is the perfect time. Remember, this offer is exclusively for new members of the ADA. Go to professional.diabetes.org/membership, create your account, fill out the application, and use the discount code NEW24 at checkout to get 25% off your first year of membership. This offer expires March 31st, 2024.
Well, let's get started with the content of the February 2024 issue of Diabetes Care.
The February 2024 issue of Diabetes Care features cover art, which is a compelling photograph by Dr. Laura Jacobsen, pediatric endocrinologist and physician scientist at the University of Florida in Gainesville, Florida. Thank you so much for joining me today, Laura, and agreeing to be part of this podcast.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
So congratulations on having your art featured. Before we discuss this specific image, I understand that art is an important part of your life. So how does art and diabetes intersect for you?
Well, I love and am very fulfilled by the work I do, by my vocation as a pediatric endocrinologist and a type 1 diabetes researcher. But at the same time, it can be really hectic and demanding. So I use art as a way to relax my mind, mainly through crochet or knitting or drawing. And I've even crocheted mini pancreas organs or other organs as gifts for people or at craft fairs. So a good intersection there.
Oh, that is fantastic. I can just imagine the questions you must get from lay people as they see during a fair, right? When they're looking, what exactly is that? And then you explain what it is, and that sparks a whole conversation, I imagine.
Yes. And then I always find the, random person with type 1 in the crowd because they come right up to it.
That's right. They're like, I want my own little pancreas to cuddle to sleep with at night. So tell us more then about the image that was selected for this month's cover of Diabetes Care. How did it happen? What does it mean to you? Maybe even describe it a bit before you start.
Absolutely. So this image is a photograph that I took in the summer of 2019 at the Florida Diabetes Camp, one of our summer programs. These programs have been occurring for the past 50 years in North Central Florida here. And we were just hanging out during one of the camp days at the basketball court. And we noticed and we're kind of admiring some of the counselors and recreational staff tattoos they had. And then we noticed that 5 or 6 of them had tattoos on their forearms. And that just made me all of a sudden want to take a picture of all of them together because there was such a variety and such a good representation of each person's individual journey with type 1. And not everyone with type 1 is alike, and none of these tattoos are alike. So I just thought that was a great way to represent that visually. So I'm happy to go over what's in the picture.
Yeah.
There are clearly 2 of the tattoos that say type 1. So basically can be used as medical alert tattoos, on the forearm. And then there are some that are more pictographic. So there's one inside a blue circle where you see an I or a 1, it looks like, and then a greater than sign and an up arrow and a down arrow. So that's actually a common pictograph that represents I am greater than my highs and lows, where the up and down arrows are representing the continuous glucose monitor readings for my blood sugars rising or falling.
I never knew that. That is so cool.
Yeah.
I never knew that.
Lots of t-shirts, lots of memes. I think a lot of people with type 1 have a very personal connection to that, right? You have type 1, but type 1 doesn't have you.
Right.
Another one of the tattoos actually has the molecular formula for insulin, which is a very complex compound. So clear relationship between type 1 and science. A lot of people with type 1 diabetes go into science or medicine. I think because they have such a deep personal experience with healthcare early on that a lot of other kids don't go through. And then the final tattoo is GPS coordinates, actually, and it's the location of the Florida Diabetes Camp. All of these were campers with type 1 who became volunteers, counselors, or rec staff. And that just shows what meant a lot to her, which was being a part of the Florida Diabetes Camp.
That's really wonderful. Really wonderful.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's really important for people to know that it's not just kids with type 1 who benefit from camp, but these are all adults with type 1 who are now volunteering at camp. And people sometimes forget that there's a role for adults with type 1 to be a great kind of role model for these people. And you can have lots of meaningful experiences, not only as a camper, but also as a volunteer. And I think a lot of the camp counselors that we've had throughout the years mostly are college students or health profession students, and they get to learn about how to help take care of kids with type 1. And that's why I'm an endocrinologist, is I volunteered at the Florida Diabetes Camp when I was in college. And that is why I'm here.
That is a wonderful connection. I couldn't agree with you more about how powerful camp is. And you mentioned, so the camps that this picture was taken were the Florida diabetes camps, you said?
Mm-hmm.
Is there a website that people could visit if they wanted to learn more about the Florida diabetes camps?
Yes, there is. It's floridadiabetescamp.org.
Excellent. And, while I'm here and I'm sitting here in Canada, Diabetes Canada also runs a series of camps. And you're absolutely right. They're just amazing for the kids that go, for the counselors that then return. And you're right, for the volunteers and for the physicians who get to go sometimes and be the quote unquote expert there. But really, we're not, right? We're really there to learn from everybody that's at the camp. So it's wonderful. So that's, I couldn't agree more. That camp is amazing. So my final question to you, Laura, is what advice would you give then to anyone who's listening, who's thinking about submitting their art to be considered for a cover of diabetes care?
Well, I would definitely highly promote people, if they have any form of art, submitting it, because I think people are becoming more and more aware art is not just a drawing. It can be lots of different media that art are presented in. And even this is a simple photograph taken with an iPhone. Don't tell anybody. That's, on the cover of Diabetes Care, but it was a meaningful moment to me and others. And it represents an important part of type 1 diabetes, which is the community people have with each other. So it doesn't really take much for others to relate to a piece of art if someone finds it meaningful. So that's all I would say about that.
Wonderful advice. So thank you. Thank you so much, Laura, for sharing your time and talent with us. And for anyone listening who has original art they wish to submit, please email the ADA at productionmanager@diabetes.org or visit the Diabetes Care website for more information.
In the February 2024 issue of Diabetes Care, one of the feature articles is a systematic review and meta-analysis entitled Optimal Dose and Type of Physical Activity to Improve Glycemic Control in People Diagnosed with Type 2 Diabetes Mellitus. It is my pleasure to welcome one of the article's senior authors, Dr. Borja del Pozo Cruz, joining us to discuss this important work. Dr. del Pozo Cruz is a senior research fellow in the Department of Health at the University of Cadiz in Spain, and adjunct associate professor in the Department of Sports Science and Clinical Biomechanics at the University of Southern Denmark. I'm so glad you could be here, Borja.
Thank you for having me.
Congratulations to you, Borja, and your colleagues on this feature article. Your systematic review and meta-analysis examines the dose-response relationship between various forms of physical activity and reduction in hemoglobin A1C among almost 7,000 participants who had a wide range of baseline hemoglobin A1C levels. One stated goal of your analysis was to verify the validity and reliability of current ADA recommendations for individuals with type 2 diabetes to engage in at least 150 minutes of moderate intensity aerobic activity or 75 minutes of vigorous intensity aerobic activity each week, as well as recommendations to engage in muscle strengthening activity at least twice a week. Now, this already sounds like a lot of exercise to me, and I think most people, and certainly is associated with a lot of health benefits. But when it comes to glycemic control, can you begin by telling us whether these recommendations are sufficient for affecting significant reductions in hemoglobin A1C?
The short answer is yes, they do. So they are able to improve, glucose level in type 2 diabetes patients. But the thing with these recommendations by ADA and other public health agencies such as the World Health Organization or even the physical activity guidelines for Americans and other across the world are all exactly the same. So essentially, these guidelines, were made to tackle different type of populations, even healthy populations, and they give you like a broad range of minutes of physical activity that you should be doing during the week in order to improve your health understood from a broader perspective. But also there are studies showing that this amount of physical activity or even directly meeting the physical activity guidelines, we can call it ADA or World Health Organization or physical activity guidelines for American, because they are the same. They do work in decreasing or lowering the HbA1c levels in type 2 diabetes patients. So they work, as you say, that's a lot of exercise, and people might feel intimidated by this much exercise they should be doing according to guidelines. So one of the things that we wanted to do is, do they really need that much exercise? What will be the minimal dose? What would be the optimal dose of physical activity that this population group might need to lower the levels of the glucose levels? And also, what would be the optimal and minimal doses of physical activity depending on the parting level of HbA1c. So, there was a lot more to uncover when it came to physical activity for type 2 diabetes. So that's what we did in our study.
And your article identifies an optimal physical activity dose of 1,100 metabolic equivalent of task or MET minutes per week. And that was associated across the entire range of baseline hemoglobin A1C. So, what can someone achieving this optimal level of physical activity expect to see in terms of A1C reduction? And how does that vary depending on their starting hemoglobin A1C?
So first of all, I think it's fair to say that this is almost double the recommendations of ADA. So if we were talking before about lots of exercise, this is way more, which again, it might appear as intimidating, but this was the dose associated with the maximum benefits in terms of HbA1c. Now, although we surprisingly found that it was the same exact, optimal dose across all ADA-defined levels of type 2 diabetes, depending on the departing level of glucose, you would expect more or less reduction in HbA1c. So, for example, if someone is diabetes but is well controlled, which means probably the HbA1c levels are lower than for someone that is uncontrolled or severe uncontrolled, then for that particular person, and I think this is kind of obvious, you would expect less reductions, 0.5, which is a lot already, or a bit less. And this was also, varied across different types of exercises. So we did both. We did the averages, and then we also worked out the dose response for different types of exercises as well, because, that way someone could tailor their recommendations to work preferences and not also the departing level of HbA1c, but also, preferences of that particular person.
Now, your article states that the 1,100 MET minute per week optimal target of physical activity is equivalent to about 36 minutes a day or 256 minutes per week of brisk walking as one example of an activity. So, how can someone know that they are walking briskly to achieve that target? And what are some examples of other activities that people can think about to hit that target and that may most efficiently meet this energy expenditure goal, given how pressed we all are each week to find enough time for exercise?
Yeah, so how can we know that we are working briskly? Well, that's a fair question. A good way, I think, to put this into perspective is, for example, if you go for a walk with someone and you try to maintain a conversation, if it's difficult to maintain that conversation, that means that you are, working briskly or more intense. That's the sort of level that you want, right? So you want 30 minutes at that level, like each day, and then you'll be, doing the right thing. Now, because meds, they can be translated into many different activities. As I said before, we've got in study in the publication, we've got translation for optimals and minimal doses that we found out for many different activities. People can go and find out exactly what that means for other activities. But, gardening, for sort of the gardening as sort of in an intense way, you're like moving quickly from one room to another, or commuting at speed that also, made the recommendations to be brisk. I don't know, cycling, swimming, really any activity at sort of a moderate to vigorous, intense level that will do the job.
Great. And I do want to echo what you said about the supplementary material in for your article is a tremendous resource of information on all the various activities and both minimal and target levels of activity to reach these energy expenditure goals. And so getting to this minimal physical activity, so your article identifies that minimal activity based on energy expenditure estimates for impacting hemoglobin A1C, and these do vary again based on individual starting A1C level. How can we use this minimal dose, for example, as in practice to start individualizing exercise prescriptions and get people started?
I think if I may, I'd like to clarify first, what do we refer with minimal here? Because it can be the minimum dose to start impacting glucose level or HbA1c levels. But for us, and the way we define minimum levels of physical activity here, minimum dose of physical activity was the minimum dose to go, for example, from uncontrolled to controlled type diabetes. So to go one step down in the ADA classification of type 2 diabetes. I think it's important to clarify that. Now, how can we use this information in practice? It's pretty simple. So you have patients they're different. They've got different nature, both in terms of the disease process and in terms of preferences, motivations, etc. So I think if you combine both, you can use the material that we've got, for example. So we've got people starting from, 8% HbA1c. Well, for that particular level of the disease, we've got one particular minimal, exercise or physical activity that you should be doing in order to move to decrease your level of your severity of the disease, if you like. But also because we've got, the supplemental material that you were talking about before, because we've got that particular dose translated into many different types of physical activity. One can pick whatever their preference is. So if I like jogging, I go and say, okay, this is the correspondent minimal dose for jogging or for gardening or for the gym we've got plenty of activities. I think this is key for many reasons, but one of them is treatment adherence. So hopefully it's useful.
Yeah, I think incredibly useful. And I think another great advantage of your article selection as a feature article is this material is all available publicly for both our listeners and the community to access and see what different activities are required, how much engagement in those activities each week is required to make that either minimal change in categorization of their glycemic control as well as where they might want to eventually achieve in terms of that optimal target of hemoglobin A1C lowering. Now, your article also identifies that the relationship between physical activity dose and hemoglobin A1C lowering is J-shaped. And so for our listeners, I want everyone to imagine a backwards tilted J with a long arm of decreasing hemoglobin A1C as met minutes per week increase up until that optimal 1100 met minutes per week. And then that's followed by a short arm of increasing hemoglobin A1C as physical activity dose goes beyond 1100. And so, Borja, what might explain the seemingly paradoxical increase in hemoglobin A1C with very high levels of physical activity? And how can we advise our patients to avoid landing on that part of the curve?
I think there's two sides of the story here. So first of all, and I think it's one of the key findings and the key ones in our study is that the biggest decrease in blood glucose levels are with less activity. So wherever you start, if you do something more, then you'll find the biggest decrease. But as you increase your level of physical activity, there's some form of adaptation to the exercise or to the physical activity. So that's when you start seeing that sort of plateauing of the care that we see. Now, the sort of slightly increase in blood glucose level with the very high levels of physical activity, let's remember that, beyond 1000 it's a lot of exercise and physical activity. It could be A, but we're not sure about that. It's because there might be some toxicity with very high levels of physical activity. And B, and this is my best bet, and this might be a bit personal, I think this is a statistical artifact. We have very little data of people doing that much exercise. So, it's very hard for us to say it's dangerous to engage in a lot of it. It's simply we don't know. We don't have that data. So the uncertainty there is big. So I wouldn't, interpret very causally that last part of the curve, if you like.
And that gets back to individualization. And so if you've met an A1C target and you've continued to extend your energy expenditure weekly and you've maintained your A1C in control, then for you, it's not having a problem and you can continue to encourage it. So that's really terrific and helps me understand that. And for most people, as you said, it's getting to the 256 minutes per week of brisk walking as an example. So 150 might be a good starting point. Certainly, that's probably for some people where their A1C is going to be an important minimal activity dose to affect an improvement in their glycemic control categorization, but getting up to that 256 optimal dose for brisk walking. And again, the article is filled with examples of for other activities for people to reference. Certainly, I feel helps to design individualized exercise prescription and should provide a terrific resource for clinicians. Finally, are there any other takeaway messages that you have for our listeners, Bora?
I think we've covered all them. So essentially, the first thing is that we could say this. We could say every step count towards improving the disease process or controlling type 2 diabetes. So if we observe those curves that we've generated, that's what it's showing. It's showing that with every single increase in physical activity, even if it's little, that still works. That still makes you healthier and helps you control type 2 diabetes. I think this is encouraging for people that might be more sedentary. You don't have to go all the way to, that level of 1 hour per day of physical activity or exercise. You can start with less, and that is still a good start. So that I'd like to stress that. And then second, we've got the guidelines and they're good, as you say, it's a good starting point to start, disentangling, the relationships between physical activity and type 2 diabetes in terms of HbA1c. But what we are really showing is that we might need to go to the, higher end of the recommendations. So we need a lot of physical activity to really, really impact the disease process or to optimize physical activity for type 2 diabetes. And then thirdly, we've repeated this during the interview, this is a resource that hopefully will help people, clinicians and the public to tailor, physical activity to their needs, really.
Dr. Borja del Pozo Cruz, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today. I really appreciate all I've learned from your paper and our discussion, and hope that this new knowledge will further assist our patients in achieving improved glycemic control through more individualized exercise prescription. I encourage our listeners to access the full article in the February issue of Diabetes Care.
One of the feature articles from the February 2024 issue of Diabetes Care is titled Genome-Wide Association Study Identifies Pharmacogenomic Variants Associated with Metformin Glycemic Response in African American Patients with Type 2 Diabetes by Dr. Baojun Wu, also known as Edison Wu, and colleagues. We are fortunate today to be joined by Drs. Baojun Wu, the lead author, as well as Dr. Keoki Williams, senior author, both from the Center for Individualized and Genomic Medicine Research at Henry Ford Health System in Detroit, Michigan. Thank you both for joining today.
Thank you for having us. It's an honor.
So first of all, congratulations to both of you and the team for authoring one of the chosen feature articles for this issue. Let's start with a fairly basic question. Why is it important to identify pharmacogenomic variants? What are the research and the clinical utilities for this kind of information?
Sure, yeah. Thank you for that question. So simply put, pharmacogenomic variants are person-to-person differences in the genetic code that serve as an indicator or biomarker for different response to medication. Pharmacogenomic variants can affect the way that our body handles or disposes of a drug. That would be a pharmacokinetic effect. Or the variants can affect the drug's mechanism of action, known as a pharmacodynamic effect. It's possible that pharmacogenomic variants may not even be involved in a drug's main pharmacokinetic or pharmacodynamic pathway, but are related to secondary effects that the drug may have, such as a drug-related side effect. And lastly, pharmacogenetic or genomic variants can be just a marker, meaning that they, in and of themselves, aren't directly involved in a drug's mechanism of action or causal pathway, but its presence is closely correlated with a causal variant. So as sequencing and genotyping become more widespread, primarily due to advances that are making this technology faster and less expensive, we are realizing the value of the data both for research and clinical use. And while pharmacogenomics is still in its early stages, the large amounts of data that are now being generated are finally making these types of studies possible. And our ultimate hope is twofold. First, we want pharmacogenomic variants that can identify new targets for treatment. And second, by having these biomarkers for treatment response, we hope that clinicians may be able to select therapies beforehand for which an individual is most likely to benefit and less likely to experience a harm or side effect.
I have to say, as a clinician, that sounds wonderful because we often make decisions based on large studies that are done and proven efficacy of this, that, and the other, and then you apply it to a given person, and it doesn't always work the way it does on paper. And I think it would be lovely if we could somehow know ahead of time, or somewhat know ahead of time, what's going to work on who and what might not. So I think it sounds wonderful, certainly to my clinical ears. So what was the specific goal then of this particular study, and what sets it apart from other pharmacogenomic genome-wide association studies?
Sure, yes. Thank you for that question. Before I answer it, I just want to make sure that I acknowledge the sponsors of this study, the National Institute of Diabetes, Digestive and Kidney Diseases, NIDDK of the NIH, who sponsored the creation of this cohort, the Diabetes Multi-Omic Investigation of Drug Response, or DIAMOND. So the overarching goal of this study that was published in Diabetes Care was to identify pharmacogenomic variants associated with metformin response in African American patients with type 2 diabetes. And interestingly, 2024 marks the 30th year since metformin was approved by the FDA for the treatment of type 2 diabetes. And yet, despite this 3 decades of use, we still don't have good indicators to tell a clinician whether or not an individual is likely to respond or not respond to metformin treatment. In earlier studies, it's been estimated that nearly a quarter to third of the variation in metformin treatment response is heritable, meaning that a large portion of the inter-individual difference and metformin response is likely to be genetic. So one of our goals was to discover novel genetic mechanisms for metformin's effect. But the other important goal was to increase the diversity of pharmacogenomic studies. And as we know, individuals with African ancestry comprise less than 1% of all individuals in genome-wide association studies, and this includes pharmacogenomic studies. But yet, in the US, Black individuals are 80% more likely to be diagnosed with diabetes, approximately 4 times more likely to be admitted to a hospital for uncontrolled diabetes, 3 times more likely to have diabetes-related end-stage renal disease, and twice as likely to die as a result of diabetes when compared to white individuals. And interestingly, in an earlier published study from our group, we found that African American individuals might actually be more likely to respond to metformin therapy when compared with white individuals. So we're interested in investigating the potential reasons for this difference.
So lots of good reasons for this study to be conducted. So now let's go into how'd you do it? How was this analysis actually carried out?
We use like diabetes multi-omic investigation of drug response cohort. We call it Diamond. This cohort consists of members of Hungerford Health, a large health system serving Southeast Michigan and metropolitan Detroit. We had a longitudinal record of diabetes treatment and were able to estimate daily exposure and HbA1c changes. And then we overlay the genetic information to see if their variants were associated with metformin relevant to the HbA1c changes. One particular unique thing is that we focus our analysis on regions homozygous for African ancestry. That means location where both chromosome copies were African origin. We did this so that we could assess for pharmacogenomics variants associated with the treatment response specific to the African genome, which permits identifying novel variants and better fine mapping. Generally, we two approaches. First, we assess for variants associated with the glycemic response individual as opposed to metformin. In our publication, we call it a high-dose exposure. Second, we looked for gene by metformin interaction. This analysis includes both high and low dose metformin exposure. This can allow us to assess how the relationship between the HbA1c change and genotype differs by level of the metformin exposure.
Okay, so you were able to get data from a fairly large cohort and also with that diversity that was been lacking, right, in a lot of other previous analyses. And so what did you find?
We looked for metformin pharmacogenomic variants in 447 African American individuals from a Diamond cohort. This is like a discovery cohort. And we identified a variance in the gene ARFGF3, also known as the big 3 genes, as a potential modified metformin treatment response. The pharmacogenomic variance reached genome-wide significance, means that it was significantly associated with the metformin response after counting for other variables and the thousands of other variants that we assessed. Big 3 is a particularly interesting gene because it is highly expressed in both alpha and beta cells in pancreatic islets and appears to be associated with glucagon and insulin granule biogenesis. Big 3 knockout mouse have increased insulin granule content that enhance insulin secretion, but appear to be susceptible to peripheral insulin resistance due to chronic oversecretion. An individual with a risk allele had a little response to metformin and had HbA1c that was 0.31 higher when on treatment when compared with a more common genotype. In addition, the risk allele had a frequency of up to 3% in individual African ancestry and close to 0 in other population groups, such as Asian, European, and Native American. Therefore, had we not studied African American individual use the approach that we did, we will not be able to find this pharmacogenomics variants.
So big 3 is what you said, right? So the big 3 genes, and this variant was found much more so in the African American cohort that you looked at. And if I understood you correctly, the presence of the risk allele meant a lower glycemic response to metformin. Did I get that right?
That is correct. The A allele, the risk allele, meant that there was lower response to individuals treated with metformin in terms of their glycemic response. Correct.
Okay. So assuming these results are replicated in future studies, because that's, I think, often necessary, right? To sort of say, yep, this is where the truth lies. So what do you think will happen with this information? What can happen with this information in the future? How can this be used?
So I'm happy to take that question. And just to highlight a few points already made by Dr. Wu, to date, this is one of the few pharmacogenomic studies involving African American individuals as a discovery population overall, not just for a diabetes drug. And in our analysis, we focused on regions homozygous for African ancestry, specifically to identify variants which haven't been previously discovered. And the variant that we found as a potential modifier of metformin drug response in this metropolitan Detroit cohort was in a gene coincidentally called the Big Three for Burfeldin A inhibited guanine nucleotide exchange protein 3. And this gene appears to have a role in glucagon and insulin granule formation in pancreatic alpha and beta islet cells. So its role in diabetes and in affecting metformin response appears, at least at face value, to be biologically plausible. And given that this variant is primarily in African American individuals, we likely would have missed it had we not included this group as our discovery population. And getting back to the question with regard to replication, we actually already had the good fortune of being able to replicate our finding in another cohort of African American patients from the Kaiser Permanente Northern California Health System. But in general, for minority populations, it's difficult to find other research groups with comparable high-quality data in which to replicate findings, and this presents an ongoing barrier to both scientific discovery and to publishing pharmacogenomic studies for minority groups. Therefore, in our situation, we were actually quite lucky to have the collaborative partners that we did have in Kaiser Permanente and in the University of California, San Francisco. In terms of additional replication, however, it would be great to study the effect of this variant in another group of individuals followed prospectively, meaning followed from into the future from the time of metformin treatment initiation. We also think that it's important to have additional functional validation of the variant that we discovered in the underlying gene, Big Three, for their role in both diabetes and in metformin response. And once we're satisfied that this variant has a role in treatment response, we would hopefully be able to use this information to guide treatment. For example, if we knew ahead of time that an individual was less likely to respond to a particular treatment, that person could be started instead on an alternative therapy more likely to bring about the desired response or outcome. And finally, if Big Three is found to play a larger role in diabetes control than previously appreciated, we may now actually have another interesting target to develop future therapies.
Now, you've already touched upon some of this. I mean, you got a listenership for this podcast of all different types of researchers from around the world. What further research would you like to see? What are next steps perhaps your group is taking or that you want others to do so that you can see this initial piece of information really flourish and develop?
So I think now with this publication of the study in diabetes care and our earlier work for other diseases and other drugs, we can confidently say that study population diversity increases our likelihood of identifying novel pharmacogenomic variants. And it also improves our ability to find map for causal genetic variants associated with disease. So step one for future research in terms of priorities would be increasing study population diversity, not only in pharmacogenomic studies, but also in genome-wide association studies in general. And this has relevance for other future research, namely for the next generation of predictive genomics, which uses the totality of the results from genome-wide association studies to generate a risk score, also known as a polygenic risk score, because it uses markers across the genome. And investigators have shown that these polygenic risk scores are capable of identifying individuals at risk for disease even in the absence of traditional clinical risk factors. So this has relevance in terms of being able to identify individuals who could benefit from earlier screening, more intensive screening, or possibly earlier treatment to prevent downstream complications. And we and other groups are starting to use this approach to predict medication treatment response with the hope of using markers across the genome to help identify individuals who are likely to benefit from treatment or who may be harmed from treatment. Again, trying to maximize the benefit and minimize harm. But it's important to note that these types of polygenic risk scores and next generation predictive genomics rely on having foundational association studies. And researchers have shown that when you develop a polygenic risk score in one population group, it doesn't necessarily work well in a different population group. So this is why studies such as ours have diverse populations are important for this type of follow-up next generation predictive genomics. And this is why we sincerely thank the editors of Diabetes Care and the American Diabetes Association for recognizing the importance of our work, because we hope that it leads to similarly diverse pharmacogenomic studies for other diabetes treatment. And without this type of work, we won't be able to apply these advances in predictive medicine, next generation predictive genomics to all individuals, regardless of their background, which is important if we have the goal of generalizable precision medicine.
Excellent. So thank you. So I want to take this opportunity to thank you both very much, Drs. Edison or Baojun Wu, as well as Dr. Keoki Williams, for sharing your expertise with us today. I think your work has really highlighted the importance of pharmacogenomic studies, particularly in diverse populations where we can learn more information, identify new potential targets, and then allow for future application in precision medicine. And one of the things I'm hoping to see maybe before I retire is that ability that a patient comes in and you're able to maybe get a drop of blood, maybe get a urine sample, maybe get a saliva sample, and then run it through a fancy machine and then have it spit out and be able to tell us what therapies would be most appropriate, what therapies to avoid, what their future risks may be for various things. But I think that is where medicine is going. So thank you to you and your group for the work that you're doing in getting us there. And I encourage the listeners to read the full article in the February issue of Diabetes Care.
Let's move on now to our rapid exchange segment, where Alice and I chat about some of the articles we found particularly interesting this month.
Mike, why don't you get us started?
Thanks, Alice. My first pick is an article taking a closer look at cardiovascular disease event risk reduction with GLP-1 receptor agonists and SGLT2 inhibitors in individuals with type 2 diabetes. Using subgroup data from cardiovascular outcomes trials, including both individuals who had established cardiovascular disease as well as those at increased risk for cardiovascular disease, Dr. Thomas Kagrianis from the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki in Greece and colleagues conducted a meta-analysis to determine 5-year anticipated treatment effects for every 1,000 treated patients. What they found is that GLP-1 agonist intervention was associated with 30 fewer patients experiencing a cardiovascular disease event who had pre-existing cardiovascular disease, and 14 fewer patients less experiencing cardiovascular disease event of those who were at increased risk. And with SGLT2 inhibitor intervention, it was 18 fewer patients who had a prior history of cardiovascular disease and 8 fewer patients who were at increased risk having an adverse cardiovascular disease event. And so this number of patient reduction in risk helps me to frame what the impact for reducing cardiovascular disease events is when recommending a drug from one of these classes to the patient sitting in front of me.
And I think, initially someone might hear those numbers and ironically be disappointed by the relatively low number, because I think we've grown to expect incredible outcome reductions. But I think it's important for people to remember this is 5-year, and we don't treat people for just 5 years, right? I mean, hopefully we're treating individuals living with type 2 diabetes for literally decades. So one can hope that that benefit would be much greater, and any individual practice will easily see those 1,000 patients. So I think the overall impact on a population basis really adds up. And this is only focused on the cardiovascular events. And as we know with these therapies, there are other organs that will benefit. So these numbers, I think, are very positive and really help provide some framework, but we need to put it in context of lifelong treatment and in the context of really large populations. But yeah, it was a very, very interesting study to see for sure. So for my first one, let's think about simple and reliable biomarkers of risk, which I think is something that is always of interest. So Dr. Harry Wang and colleagues from the Population Health Research Institute in Hamilton, Canada, with the senior author of Dr. Marie Piegère, assessed the relationship between plasma vaspin concentration and incident and prevalent type 2 diabetes and adiposity-related variables. What is vaspin, you ask? Because certainly I did. Vaspin is also known as visceral adipose tissue-derived serine protease inhibitor. It is an adipokine reported in various tissues in humans with differential expression between subcutaneous and visceral adipose tissue. Could it be a factor then that mediates the effect of adipose tissue on type 2 diabetes risk? To answer that, the group looked at vaspin levels of a subset of participants in 2 studies. The PURE study, an international prospective cohort study of 225,000 participants from 27 countries with 9.8 years of median follow-up, as well as the ORIGIN study, a randomized factorial study of glargine U100, as well as omega-3 fatty acid supplements versus standard care. What they found was that higher vaspin levels were associated with higher incidence of type 2 diabetes, adjusted for BMI. For every 1 standard deviation increase in vaspin level, there was a 16% increase in type 2 diabetes incidence. There was also an association with reduced gluteofemoral adipose tissue. Therefore, the authors conclude that vaspin is a novel biomarker linking gluteofemoral body fat and type 2 diabetes and may become a potential therapeutic target to lower type 2 diabetes risk.
And this fits, Alice, with what we know about the greater metabolic risk associated with an apple as opposed to a pear-shaped body habitus, where the apple lacks the gluteofemoral body fat preferentially stored by the pear. So it's fascinating to me to think how this effect of reduced gluteofemoral body fat may be mediated, at least in part, via the adipokine vaspin. My next pick examines the benefits of 2 advanced hybrid closed-loop systems for glycemic control and patient-reported outcomes in a real-world setting. Dr. Pilar Isabel Beto de Borja from the University Hospital of Badajoz in Spain and colleagues analyzed outcomes in 150 adolescents and adults with type 1 diabetes. And here, 75 each were in a group that initiated automated insulin delivery with either the Medtronic 780G system or the Tandem T-Slim system of hybrid closed-loop insulin delivery. Now, each of these systems uses a different control algorithm, and what they saw over 3 months was that both groups demonstrated an almost 15% increase in time spent in the normal glucose range of 70 to 180, and just greater than 0.5% decrease in hemoglobin A1C, with no difference in glycemia seen between the treatment groups. Improvement in fear of hypoglycemia, quality of life, and sleep quality were also similar between users of each system, although the T-Slim system was associated with slightly greater improvement in diabetes-related distress measure. These results support really no superiority of one advanced hybrid closed-loop system over the other in clinical practice. And since we're unlikely to see such a head-to-head comparison in a randomized clinical trial, these are welcome data to support ensuring availability to more than one automated delivery system option for our patients with type 1 diabetes.
And it's always great to have choice. And I think these data really help support the fact that either system works really well, and it allows individuals to pick, right? To pick which system is going to suit their life the best. So it's great. It's really great to see these types of data. So one thing we do at this time of year in February in Canada, and I imagine it's true for you too, Mike, is we dream of warmer climates. Therefore, I couldn't help but pick this one next to discuss. Dr. Ayush Vasaria, with the senior author of Soto Setoguchi from Rutgers Institute in New Jersey, along with colleagues from Taiwan, measured the association between ambient heat and hypoglycemia-related emergency department visits or hospitalizations in older adults 65 years of age plus who use insulin in the United States as well as Taiwan in the summer months. After identifying over 32,000 hypoglycemia cases in the US and over 10,000 hypoglycemia cases in Taiwan, they estimated the odds of hypoglycemia by heat index percentile categories. The heat index takes into account the absolute temperature and the relative humidity. The risk of a serious hypo event among insulin users was about 40% higher on days with a heat index greater than or equal to 99th percentile compared to the 25th to 74th percentile. Conversely, low heat index of less than 25th percentile was associated with lower risk of hypoglycemia. The authors propose a potential physiologic explanation in that higher temperatures can increase peripheral and cutaneous vasodilation, thereby increasing insulin delivery and also increase insulin sensitivity, leading to a risk of hypoglycemia. Interestingly, other smaller studies have shown an increased risk of hypoglycemia at colder temperatures in the winter months. So maybe it's the extremes of temperature issue, something worth noting clinically when counseling our patients, and yet another way that the climate crisis is adversely affecting health.
Yes, and the effect of heat increasing peripheral blood flow makes me think, Alice, of the similar effect of exercise that's also been shown to increase insulin absorption from peripheral depots, and so fits with the hypothesized mechanism for the development of heat-associated hypoglycemia. I agree this is an important concept to discuss with our insulin-treated patients, in particular, our older patients who are at greater risk for both heat-related illness and hypoglycemia. My last pick is from Dr. Timothy Foster and colleagues at University of Florida in Gainesville, who conducted a pilot study of off-label use of low-dose antithymocyte-globulin, or ATG, which is a polyclonal antibody that depletes T lymphocytes, examining for an effect of delayed progression from stage 2 pre-type 1 diabetes to stage 3 or over clinical type 1 diabetes. 6 children between the ages of 5 and 14 years of age were treated, and over 1.5 to 4 years of follow-up, 3 remained diabetes-free, while the other 3 developed diabetes within a few months of receiving treatment. Although those that developed diabetes have maintained near normal glycemic control with low insulin requirement due to preserved endogenous beta cell function. Low-dose ATG has already been shown by this group to preserve beta cell function at the onset of stage 3 type 1 diabetes. So this being a 2-day course of infusion therapy relative to what's currently approved as a 14-day course of tolizumab for prevention of developing stage 3 type 1 diabetes, these data support another potential alternative intervention for disease-modifying therapy that could impact the autoimmune process before substantial beta cell loss has occurred.
And what's great about this, Mike, is I guess it's all about trying to preserve beta cells as best we can for as long as we can. And I think the more strategies, the better. And it's an exciting field to keep our eyes on. And I think as the therapies become more simple, right, that's really going to be quite impactful for individuals. My final pick falls into the category of things we were taught that are in fact not true. Let's talk about the concept of burnt out diabetes in those with end-stage kidney disease. It is reported that approximately 20% of people with diabetes and end-stage kidney disease develop quote unquote burnt out diabetes, defined as an A1C under 6.5% with no antihyperglycemic therapy for more than 6 months. Dr. Candice Kaminsky and colleagues from Emory University, with the senior author Professor Guillermo Ampires, performed a pilot prospective study assessing glycemic control by CGM, A1C, glycated albumin, and fructosamine in 20 people with end-stage kidney disease and burnt-out diabetes, as well as 20 people with end-stage kidney disease and no diabetes. Those with burnt-out diabetes had higher CGM-measured daily glucose, lower percent time in range, and longer duration of hyperglycemia. Glycated albumin was also higher in those with burnt-out diabetes. Interestingly, however, A1C and fructosamine levels were similar to those without diabetes. Therefore, clinically, those with so-called burnt-out diabetes are in fact experiencing hyperglycemia, and CGM and glycated albumin are better measures of glycemic control than A1C or fructosamine in those with end-stage kidney disease.
I'm really glad you picked this one, Alice, and that the article helps it debunk a false concept. Another feature of end-stage kidney disease is the markedly reduced renal clearance of insulin that can mask significantly reduced beta cell function. And so having better markers of hyperglycemia in our patients with end-stage kidney disease is really important, and I'll certainly be ordering more glycated albumin measures, particularly when sufficient glucose monitoring data are not available. Now, this brings us to the end of our February 2024 episode. Please remember that ADA is offering 25% off membership dues for new members if you use the discount code NEW24 when you subscribe online. This offer expires March 31st.
And remember that Diabetes Care is continuing to take submissions of original art for consideration to be included on a future journal cover. Don't forget to subscribe to get notifications about new episodes, and thank you so much for listening.